In the spring of 1943, the German Luftwaffe owned the skies over southern Russia. For almost 2 years, the men of Jagdgeschwader 52 had flown over the Eastern Front like they owned it, racking up victory tallies no air force in history had ever seen. Erich Hartmann was there. So was Gerhard Barkhorn. So was Gunther Rahl. The 3 highest-scoring fighter pilots who would ever live, all in one wing, all flying the Messerschmitt 109, all of them sharpening their kills in the same patch of sky. And then, over a muddy river delta on the Black Sea coast, something happened that nobody in Berlin saw coming. A Soviet fighter showed up that could actually fight back. Not just survive, fight back and win. By early June, the Luftwaffe had lost control of that sky for the first time, and they would never get it back. This is the story of the Yak-9, the Soviet fighter that broke the German grip over the Kuban, and the 8 weeks of brutal air fighting that turned the entire air war on the Eastern Front upside down. To understand why this mattered so much, you have to understand where the Soviet Air Force was coming from, because for the first 18 months of the war, it had been a slaughter, a one-sided, humiliating slaughter. When Germany invaded in June of 1941, the Luftwaffe destroyed thousands of Soviet aircraft in the first week alone. Most of them never even got off the ground. They were caught lined up wingtip to wingtip on their own airfields, neat rows of fighters and bombers that German pilots strafed and bombed at their leisure. The planes that did manage to fly were obsolete. The pilots were half-trained, sometimes pushed into combat with only a few dozen hours in the air, and the tactics were worse than the planes. The standard Soviet fighter formation in those early days was something called the Troika, 3 aircraft flying tight together in a rigid V. It looked tidy on a parade ground. In combat, it was a death sentence. 2 of the 3 pilots spent the whole fight staring at their leader's tail, trying not to crash into him, instead of watching the sky for the enemy. Worse, the doctrine chained them to the ground troops below, ordered to circle slowly over the front line at low altitude where the infantry could see them. That made them sitting ducks. German pilots called Soviet formations easy hunting, and for 2 years that is exactly what they were. But the Soviets were learning. Slowly, painfully, in blood, they were learning. And by the spring of 1943, 2 things had finally come together at the same time: new tactics and a new aircraft that could actually carry those tactics into the fight. That aircraft was the Yakovlev Yak-9. It had entered service in late 1942, right as the Battle of Stalingrad was grinding toward its terrible climax. And on paper, it did not look like a war winner. It was small, it was simple. Large parts of it were still made of wood, because the Soviet aviation industry could not get enough aluminum to go around. The wing spars were metal, but the skin over much of the airframe was plywood and fabric. A German engineer who took one apart would have sneered at the workmanship. But that simplicity was the whole point. The Yak-9 was light, it was fast, it was nimble down low, where most of the fighting on the Eastern Front actually happened, because the war in the East was an army's war, and the fighters lived close to the mud. Its Klimov engine put out around 1,250 horsepower, and the top marks could push past 430 miles an hour. It could climb, it could turn, and most important of all, the Soviets could build them by the thousand. They could put a barely trained farm boy in the cockpit and still send him into a fight with a real chance of coming home. Before the war ended, factories would turn out more than 14,000 Yak-9s of all types. That is not just an aircraft, that is a flood. The standard Yak-9 carried one 20mm SHVAK cannon firing straight through the propeller hub, with about 120 rounds, plus 1 or 2 12.7mm UBS machine guns mounted on the nose. That cannon-through-the-nose layout was deadly accurate, because there was no wing-mounted gun spread to worry about. On most fighters of the era, the guns sat out in the wings, and were angled to converge at a single point a few hundred yards ahead. Miss that range, and your fire scattered. On the Yak, you pointed the nose at the enemy, and everything went exactly where you were looking, at any distance. For a young pilot with shaky aim, that was a gift. And then there was the monster, the Yak-9T. Same airframe, but instead of the 20mm, the engineers jammed a 37mm NS-37 cannon through the hub. 37mm. That is a gun you would normally bolt to the deck of a warship, or stand on a field carriage to shoot down aircraft, and they mounted it inside a single-engine fighter and asked a man to fly it. To make it fit, they had to move the whole cockpit back, almost 1.5 feet further down the fuselage, just to balance the weight of that enormous gun in the nose. It carried only about 30 rounds, and the recoil was brutal. Fire a long burst, and the whole airplane shuddered and bled off speed like it had run into a wall, the nose kicking up so hard the pilot lost his aim. So you could not spray it. A pilot had to aim with a sniper's patience, 2 or 3 rounds at a time, holding his nerve until the target filled the gun sight. But when those rounds connected, one good hit could cripple a locomotive on the ground or tear the wing clean off a German bomber in the air. A single 37mm shell carried more punch than a dozen rifle-caliber rounds. It was a flying anti-tank gun, and for the targets it was built to kill, nothing the Germans had could absorb it. So that was the weapon. Now the Soviets needed the right place, and the right men, to prove what it could do. That place was the Kuban. If you look at a map of southern Russia, find the Black Sea, then trace the coast east toward the Caucasus Mountains. Right there, where the land bulges out into the sea, is the Taman Peninsula and the wide, marshy delta of the Kuban River. Flat, waterlogged ground, threaded with reed beds and lagoons. In the spring of 1943, this little corner of the world became the most violent piece of airspace on planet Earth. Here is how it got that way. After the catastrophe at Stalingrad, the German army in the south was in full retreat, but it managed to pull back into a fortified bridgehead on the Taman Peninsula, holding the gateway to the Crimea and clinging to the dream of one day driving back toward the Caucasus oil fields. The German 17th Army, more than 250,000 men, dug into that bridgehead. The Germans called their defensive line the Gottenkopf, the Goth's head. The Soviets called it the Blue Line. Whoever controlled the air over it would decide whether the 17th Army survived or died, because everything on that crowded peninsula, every supply convoy, every troop position, lay exposed to whoever owned the sky. And so, both sides poured everything they had into a strip of sky barely 60 miles across. The Luftwaffe sent Luftflotte 4, the cream of its forces in the east, commanded by Field Marshal Wolfram von Richthofen, a cousin of the legendary Red Baron of the First War, and the most respected air commander Germany had. Under him came Jagdgeschwader 52, with its terrifying collection of aces, plus more fighter and dive bomber units, Ju-87 Stukas, and the deadly new Focke-Wulf 190. The Soviets sent the 4th Air Army, commanded by General Konstantin Vershinin, backed by elements of the 5th Air Army, the naval pilots of the Black Sea Fleet, and regiment after regiment of Guards fighters and IL-2 ground attack planes. At its peak, the Soviet side had somewhere between 700 and 900 aircraft crammed into the area. The Germans, stretched thin across a collapsing front, could field only 200 to 300. On the worst days, 300 to 400 aircraft were tangled in the same sky at the same time over a single village. Pilots described it as a swirling, three-dimensional knife fight, where you could not tell friend from enemy until you were close enough to see the markings. Tracer crossed in every direction. Burning planes fell through the formations of the planes still fighting. Parachutes drifted down through the smoke while the battle raged on around them. Men were shot down who never even saw who hit them. The fighting came in 3 brutal waves. The first wave opened on the 17th of April, when the Germans tried to wipe out a tiny Soviet beachhead at Miskarko, near the port of Novorossiysk. It was a desperate scrap of ground the Soviets called Malaya Zemlya, the small land, a sliver of coast barely a few miles deep that Soviet Marines were clinging to by their fingernails. The Germans wanted it gone, and they sent wave after wave of Ju-87 Stukas to bomb it into the sea. For the first few days they did it almost unopposed. The screaming dive bombers peeled over the beachhead and dropped their loads with the same arrogance they had shown for 2 years. The Stukas had it their own way. But within 3 days, Soviet fighters arrived in force, and the Stukas stopped having it their own way. This was the moment everything started to shift. And to understand why, you need to meet the man who rewrote the rulebook. His name was Alexander Pokryshkin. Now, here is the honest part of the story, the part a lot of channels get wrong. Pokryshkin did not fly the Yak-9 over the Kuban. He flew an American fighter, the P-39 Airacobra, sent to the Soviets through Lend-Lease. So why is he in this story? Because the tactics Pokryshkin perfected in that sky were the tactics that turned every good Soviet fighter, the Yak-9 included, from prey into predator. He did not just win his own fights, he handed the entire Soviet Air Force a new way to fly. Pokryshkin was not some fresh recruit. He was an engineer by training, a man obsessed with the mechanics of air combat in a way most of his comrades were not. He had spent 2 years watching those comrades die in the rigid troika formations, circling slowly over the front line at low altitude, fat and predictable, waiting for German fighters to dive out of the sun and pick them off one by one. He hated it with a cold fury. For years he had been filling notebooks with sketches and calculations and ideas, working out the geometry of the dive and the climb, the trade between speed and height. And for years he had gotten in trouble for it, clashing with superiors who did not want to hear that the official tactics, the tactics written in the manuals, were getting their own men killed. Over the Kuban, he finally got to throw the rulebook in the fire. His formula was 4 words: altitude, speed, maneuver, fire. Say it like that, and it sounds simple. In practice, it changed everything. Altitude first. Instead of circling low where the Germans could dive on them, Pokryshkin's pilots climbed high and stayed there, stacked in layers, each group covering the one below it. Height was energy, and energy was life. Now it was the Soviets who waited up in the sun, and the Soviets who came screaming down. Speed second. He banned the slow defensive circle that had killed so many. His fighters never flew straight and level, never bled off their energy waiting to be jumped. They cruised in long, weaving arcs, always fast, always ready to convert that speed into a slashing attack or a climbing escape. A fast fighter has choices, a slow one only has prayers. Maneuver third. Forget the low, flat turning fights the Germans were so good at. Pokryshkin fought in the vertical. Dive in fast, hit hard, then zoom back up to altitude on the energy you gained from the dive and come down again. Dive and zoom. He understood that you should never let a Messerschmitt drag you into a slow-turning duel down low, because that was the one game the German pilots almost always won. Take the fight up and down instead of round and round, and you took away their advantage. And fire last. Hold your shot until you are close, dead close, then fire one short, killing burst, and break away. Do not spray your ammunition across the sky. Do not linger in the enemy's gun sight admiring your work. One pass, one kill, gone. On the 29th of April, the day the second great wave of fighting opened around the village of Krimskaya, Pokryshkin showed the world what the formula could do. Leading a group of 8 Airacobras, he climbed high, spotted 3 squadrons of Ju-87 Stukas droning toward the front under a Messerschmitt escort, and rolled in from above. When it was over, a dozen German aircraft were falling out of the sky, and 5 of them belonged to Pokryshkin alone. 8 Soviet fighters went in. Not one of them was lost. Stay with that for a second. 2 years earlier, 8 Soviet fighters running into escorted German bombers would have been the ones falling out of the sky, their wreckage scattered across the steppe. Now, the math had flipped completely. The hunters had become the hunted, and they did not even understand yet why. If you are enjoying this story so far, take 1 second and subscribe. This channel covers the weapons and the battles of the Eastern Front that most of the West has never heard of, and there is a lot more coming. Krimskaya was the heart of the whole battle. The village sat on a vital railroad junction just inland from Novorossiysk, the hinge of the entire German Blue Line, and when the Soviet 56th Army launched its ground offensive there at the end of April, both air forces threw everything they had into the sky above it. This is the phase the history books remember, the days when 300 and 400 aircraft fought over a single point on the map, when squadrons took off, fought, landed, rearmed, and took off again, 4 and 5 and 6 times in a single day, until the pilots could barely climb out of their cockpits. And this is where the Yak-9 came into its own. Picture the layered Soviet formation Pokryshkin had designed, now flown by Yak-9 and La-5 fighters across the whole front. High up, a top cover of fighters waited in the sun, watching, holding their height. Below them, a middle layer patrolled, ready to plunge. And down low, close to the IL-2 attack planes they were protecting, a third layer kept watch over the bombers. When German fighters dived in to attack, they had to punch through all 3 layers, and every layer could fall on them with the advantage of height and speed. It was a trap built out of altitude. The Yak-9 was perfect for it. Light and fast, with that hub-mounted cannon that put rounds exactly where the nose pointed, it could make one devastating diving pass and climb straight back to safety on its own momentum. The German pilots, so used to easy kills, suddenly found themselves boxed in, hunted from above, unable to dive away to escape because there was always another Soviet fighter waiting below to catch them. The escape route that had saved them 100 times was now a death trap. And it was not just the airplanes. The Soviets had finally built something the Luftwaffe had taken for granted since the start of the war, a real radio and ground control network. Early warning radar sets, the RUS-2 Redoute, swept the sky and picked up the German formations forming up far away. Observers on the ground tracked them and called the warnings up to the fighters by radio. And here was the crucial part. Commanders directed the whole battle from the ground in real time, listening to the picture build and vectoring fresh squadrons exactly where they were needed, when they were needed. For 2 years the Soviets had flown half-blind, each formation alone with whatever its pilots happened to see. Now they could see the whole sky, and they could move men around it like pieces on a board. The men of Jagdgeschwader 52 felt the change in their bones, even if they could not yet admit what it meant. Günter Rahl had scored his first victory over the Kuban bridgehead back in late March, and the German aces were still piling up enormous personal tallies. That part was real, and it is worth saying plainly. Man for man, the best German pilots were still extraordinary, and they kept shooting Soviet planes down. But the wing as a whole was bleeding. After the 17th of April, roughly a third of the pilots in one of its groups were knocked out of action, killed, wounded, or shot down. A young pilot named Erich Hartmann, who would one day finish the war as the highest-scoring ace in history, claimed his 17th kill over the Kuban on the 23rd of May, then 2 days later collided with a Soviet LAGG-3 in the chaos and had to crash land. Even the future legends were getting roughed up in that sky. Here is the brutal truth the German aces could not escape. It did not matter how many Soviet planes one pilot shot down, if there were always 10 more behind it, and if every one of those 10 could now fight back. A tally of 100 kills means nothing if the enemy has 200 fresh fighters and you have 9 tired ones. That is the math that broke the Luftwaffe. And it is worth being careful with the numbers, because both sides exaggerated wildly in the heat of it. Soviet pilots claimed somewhere around 1,100 German aircraft destroyed over the Kuban. Modern researchers, digging through the actual German loss records, put the real figure far lower, somewhere in the range of 400 to 600 from all causes: combat, accidents, and everything else. And the Soviets lost heavily too, at least 750 aircraft of their own, probably more. Pilots in the swirl of a 400-plane brawl simply could not tell whose tracer hit what, and every side counted generously. So this was not a clean, lopsided victory. It was a meat grinder, costly for everyone who flew into it. But here is what made it a turning point anyway. The Soviets could replace their losses. Their factories, safe behind the Urals, were now pumping out Yak-9s and LA-5s faster than the Germans could shoot them down. And their training schools were finally producing competent pilots in real numbers instead of half-trained boys. Luftwaffe 4 could not replace anything. Germany was now fighting on too many fronts, its industry stretched to breaking, its fuel running short. Every experienced German pilot lost over the Kuban was gone for good, and there was no one of equal skill waiting to take his place. The Soviets could trade losses all day and grow stronger. The Germans could not trade at all without growing weaker. The third and final wave came in late May and early June, as the fighting shifted to the German Blue Line defences across the body of the Taman Peninsula. By now the pattern was set in stone. The Soviets had air superiority, and they kept it through sheer, relentless pressure, grinding the German fighter strength down day after day, sortie after sortie, never letting up. The IL-2 ground attack planes, once easy prey, now ranged over the German lines under solid fighter cover, hammering the trenches and supply roads of the 17th Army. By the 7th of June, the great air battle over the Kuban was effectively over, and the verdict was clear to everyone who had been there. For the first time in the entire war, the Soviet Air Force had taken control of the sky from the Luftwaffe in a sustained, stand-up fight, and held it. Not for an afternoon, not over one lucky raid. For weeks, over a contested battlefield against the best the enemy had. Think about how far they had come. In June of 1941, Soviet fighters were destroyed by the thousand on the ground, flown by half-trained boys in obsolete planes using suicidal tactics, written off by the whole world as a beaten air force. 2 years later, over the same kind of ground, against the most decorated fighter wing in the history of aerial warfare, they outflew them, outthought them, and outfought them. What changed? 3 things, all of them coming together over that muddy delta on the Black Sea. A fighter good enough to win, the Yak-9, fast and simple and built by the 1,000, with a cannon through the nose that hit exactly where the pilot looked, and a big gun cousin in the Yak-9T that could blow a bomber apart with a single shell. Tactics good enough to win. Pokryshkin's 4 words, altitude, speed, maneuver, fire, carried out of the Kuban and spread across the whole Soviet Air Force until every fighter regiment in the country flew that way, stacked high and fast and vertical instead of slow and low and doomed. And an industry and a training system that could absorb terrible losses and keep coming, again and again and again, while the enemy could not absorb even one. The German aces of Jagdgeschwader 52 would go on fighting for 2 more years, and their personal scores would climb into numbers that still seem impossible today. Hartmann would finish with 352 claimed victories, the most of anyone, ever, a record that will almost certainly never be broken. Barkhorn and Rahl would not be far behind him. But all those victories could not change what happened in the spring of 1943. The Luftwaffe walked into the Kuban as the undisputed masters of the eastern sky. They walked out having lost that sky for good, and they spent the rest of the war on the back foot, defending instead of hunting. The Yak-9 did not do it alone. No single weapon ever does. But it was the fighter in the right place at the right moment, in the hands of men who had finally figured out how to fly and fight and win. And the 8 weeks over the Kuban were the moment the air war in the east turned, slowly and bloodily, in favour of the side that 2 years earlier everyone had written off as finished. If you want to see how the other great Soviet fighter of this era, the LA-5, took the fight to the Germans in the skies over Kursk just weeks later, that video is on screen right now. Click it and keep watching.